I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the latest news from Ukraine and Europe, and we analyse the view of Putin's invasion from Central Asia with our correspondent James Kilner, who's on the ground in Nur-Sultan, the capital of Kazakhstan.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Monday, the 20th of June, day 117. And today I'm joined by Assistant Foreign Editor Katie O'Neill, Assistant Comment Editor Francis Dearnley, and Telegraph Correspondent James Kilner, who's joining us from Kazakhstan. I started by asking Katie and Francis for the latest news from Ukraine.
Hello, David. Hello, everyone. A lot of action happening today, actually, in Ukraine and on the war front. There's been two attacks that are quite notable. One of them recorded on Snake Island, that infamous island that we've all come to know so well, where a lot of Russian kit and military might is stationed. There were explosions recorded there this morning, which potentially indicates that some sort of Ukrainian counter-attack happened there. Similarly, there is a oil rig off the coast of Crimea, which is obviously the annexed region of Ukraine, which is operated by Russians. This oil rig is, and missiles have struck that rig today. The Russians are saying that no one was killed, but that there were a number of injuries amongst the workers that were on that rig. So there is a sort of growing sense that the Ukrainians are attacking and counter-attacking in new territory. Similar scenes over the weekend in Kherson, that Russian-occupied city in Ukraine. A local prison boss, was subject to a assassination attempt by the Ukrainians. An explosion went off near his car over the weekend. He survived. He is recovering from his injuries. But again, a sense of a growing resistance among Ukrainians and them sort of shifting focus to areas that are occupied by the Russians.
Thanks, Katie. Francis, do you want to come in on Snake Island? I know you had some thoughts on it.
Yes, thank you, David. It's very interesting seeing the developments around Snake Island today, not least because I was speaking to a listener of this podcast about it just last week, who's been following the situation on Snake Island very closely. And he made a very good point, which is that obviously we're familiar with Snake Island because of the sinking of the Moskva, and obviously in the beginning of the war, it was Ukrainian-held territory, and there was the famous message of defiance to the Russian invaders from the Ukrainians who were stationed there. They were initially believed killed, but we now know that they actually survived. I'm going to say its military significance is that with the sinking of the Moskva, two things happened in the theatre there. Effectively, there were some significant changes in how the Black Sea Fleet was training for the war, and sort of more of an intense workup around Crimea. And essentially, the base of operations for this was Snake Island. And so now we are seeing what we expect to be an attempt by the Ukrainian High Command to effectively destroy Snake Island as a strategic base. It's significant because it's been able to be used for air attacks, we believe, not only air but also surface assets as well. And so it's been a significant thorn in the Ukrainian side now, ever since the losing of the island. And I think we're now starting to see a significant counterattack, which will have quite significant military ramifications.
Thanks, Francis. Katie, coming back to you, what's away from the south and in the north, Kharkiv and the Donbass, what's the latest from there?
So just generally elsewhere, we have Zelensky saying today that he expects the Russians to really up the ante in terms of their attacks in Ukraine and the sort of level of assaults that they are staging. The reason for this, he says, is because the EU is this week considering whether or not to grant Ukraine access to the bloc. Initially, Russia sort of played down how much it cared that Ukraine, was making this bid to join the European Union, saying that it wasn't a military or defensive bloc, and it made no odds to them whether or not they joined. But the intelligence that Zelensky has clearly seen indicates that they're going to up the ante in terms of the attacks that they're mounting this week. Also over the weekend, we had Jens Stoltenberg, the chief of NATO, saying that we are in for a very long war, saying that the world needs to be prepared for years more of conflict in Ukraine, and that tallies with remarks that Boris Johnson made over the weekend. So yeah, sort of a sense of both a particularly violent, perhaps, week ahead, and then, within the sort of more broader global community, warnings that this isn't going to end anytime soon.
And Francis, just on the EU, staying with the EU, EU foreign ministers are meeting in Luxembourg today to discuss ways to free the millions of tons of grain stuck in Ukraine thanks to the Black Sea port blockade implemented by the Russians. Do you have thoughts on this?
Yes, well, we've spoken in the past on the podcast about how significant the grain crisis is from the perspective of many of the European leaders and, of course, global leaders as well. Talks of the severe ramifications not only on the cost of living, but also in Africa and other places that are really heavily reliant on this grain. And I've cited in the past a statement by the Right Honourable Alex Shelbrooke MP, who's the leader of the UK delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And I won't read it all again, but when I summarised it before, essentially it was him saying that this was a absolutely central part of the conversations that are taking place within NATO, including consideration of there being a possible joint expeditionary force of naval vessels that could be involved in escorting grain out of Ukraine. But the developments today are significant because Germany now, we understand, is supporting Poland and Romania in adapting their railways to enable the export of millions of tons of grain stock that's in Ukraine, and as obviously remains in Ukraine due to the Russian sea blockade. So we're hearing from the German foreign minister, and I will quote from her. So the quote: "The railway tracks need to be modernised. We need the right cargo wagons. The German government is working on this with many other actors. It is clear that, in the end, we will certainly not be able to get out all grain, but if we even just manage to free part of it on various routes, then this will help as we are facing this global challenge." So it's very interesting, I think, that this is clearly such a significant topic of conversation, and it just reiterates the points that we've made several times before on this podcast, that this is a war, of course, that is not only military in scope, but it is one that is being fought on the food front and the information front and the energy front as well. And this, as I say, it speaks to that.
And just one more question from me before we bring in James Kilner. Just on the energy front, Francis, Germany has decided to restart its coal power stations. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Well, yes. I mean, it's quite remarkable, isn't it, that Germany, which over several years has closed down its nuclear power stations and has been opting to obviously purchase considerable Russian oil and gas, but has also been one of the pioneering countries of the sort of net zero agenda, if one were to articulate it as that, within the European Union. And so we're seeing, as you say, an enormous about turn here as Germany is to reopen these mothballed coal power plants to help combat the high gas prices. And of course, this has also been, we understand, part of the conversations that have been having between Germany and Britain. Listeners may recall when Olaf Scholz came and visited Downing Street and met with Boris Johnson, we understand that was on the agenda there. And there was even talk of Britain providing some support in the interim whilst Germany was unmothballing, if that's the word, bad English, but you know what I'm saying, these coal power plants. And we also understand as well that the German government is intending to pass emergency laws to reactivate them. So again, speaking to the sense of urgency here. But I think we're broadly seeing now Europe adapting to the severe security threat that Russia's stranglehold on Europe in regard to energy has had and is having. But of course, this will take time. And we obviously listened to Louis last week talking about the sort of shadow fleets that are still operating in an attempt to find ways around the embargoes and things like that are taking place. And so this is a very complicated picture. But clearly, Europe is trying to signal that it is serious. But I think it's such a U-turn that this is going to take months, potentially years, and to Katie's point, this would speak to that you cannot reverse a radical shift in energy policy overnight.
Thank you very much, Francis. I'd like to turn to James Kilner and invite James to speak with us. Thank you so much for your time, James. James, you're out in Kazakhstan at the moment. Can you give us just a very quick sense of the stories you've been working on? And then what I'd quite like, and what I'm sure listeners would find quite useful, is just a sort of overview of the history of Central Asia and Russia, because I think that will really give us the right foundations for some of the stories you've been working on.
So I'm wrapping up a 3-week trip around Kazakhstan, focused on Almaty, the former capital. And then I went up to Uralsk on the border with Russia. And now I'm in Nur-Sultan, the current capital. And the focus of this 3-week trip was twofold mainly. It was to follow up on the unrest that really shook Kazakhstan in January and involved Russia. Putin sent down 2,000 paratroopers to help quash that unrest. Paratroopers that he would later use to try and capture Kiev. So it was to follow up on that story, and it was also to have a look at how the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, looked from Kazakhstan, a neighbouring former Soviet country. So I'm wrapping that up, and then I deputised for Natalia, the Telegraph's Russia correspondent, and I was on duty on Friday when Putin gave an important speech at the end of the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, a speech which it was a major speech, and I'll come on to it in a minute. But the president of Kazakhstan was also on the forum with him, so that added a Central Asia angle to that. As for Russia and Central Asia, very briefly, it's a region I've covered for 20 years, all of my career. I've lived here several times, very fond of the place. The former Soviet Central Asia states, there's 5 of them: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. They all became independent when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And really their story in the last 30 years has been about building up their own national identity, or identities rather, solidifying that, getting the ordinary people on side, economic development, resource management, kleptocratic regimes, the odd bit of violence, etc. And then also, very importantly, managing to walk along this sort of international relations tightrope between Russia and China and also the West. And that really has been a huge challenge, especially with things like Afghanistan on their doorstep, oil pipelines, this sort of thing. And for Kazakhstan, this is particularly acute because it shares, I think, it's the longest land border in the world with Russia. Its northern border with Russia is huge, and along its northern regions, there's a belt of cities or towns which are they range between a third populated by ethnic Russians and up to 65% in some cases. So they have this huge sort of vulnerability, if you want, and huge reliance on Russia, which Russian's still very widely spoken in the area. And links with Russian business is very important, and the Russian state and government is very important. The Kremlin is hugely important. They're involved in lots of economic unions with Russia. Eurasian Economic Union, for example, is a Kremlin-centric sort of economic space, although it was officially set up in Almaty, it's Kremlin-centric. And then there's something called the CSTO, which is a sort of pseudo-military group which was used to send the Russian soldiers to Kazakhstan in January. So, and Kazakhstan and other states in Central Asia are part of this. So there's lots of levers that the Kremlin has over Central Asia and Kazakhstan. And when Putin triggered his invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, I think he expected full backing from, in some ways, his vassal states in Central Asia. But they have proved incredibly sort of independent, and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, to name are the two most prominent examples. They have both stood up and said that they respect the international, they respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So they're not fully behind this war in Russia, and that is and has caused them huge headaches, which I was investigating.
Could you take us through why exactly they've stood up and said that? Why are they not backing Moscow, and what was Moscow's reaction to that?
The line from the Kazakhs is that they do not regard to Donbass, rebel Donbass regions in Ukraine that Kremlin supports as independent states. It's a policy they've had for a long time. Partly, I mean, none of these countries want to encourage any potential splinter regions in their own territory. So they have to generally come down quite hard on sort of separatist tendencies in eastern Ukraine or in Georgia or in Moldova with Transnistria, etc. And also, I think it's very important for these Central Asian states like Kazakhstan not to drift into this sort of Lukashenko Belarusia area where they really become like a little bit of a crazy Russian sub-state, which is kind of where Belarusia and Lukashenko is, unfortunately. And they have to play the game with backing Kremlin a little bit, but also backing the West a bit, and also playing them off against China's interests. And that is what they're trying to do in this war. And that was what made it so. There's an incredibly dramatic moment on Friday at this during this big speech in St. Petersburg that Putin had just given. He gave a 75-minute speech, which was very bombastic. He seemed incredibly invigorated by his military successes in Donbass. He was talking about how he was going to propel Russia to the top of a new world order. He was telling, fronting up to the US, reminding everyone how arrogant he thought the US was. He was telling the EU that their sanctions were a waste of time and it was going to cost them more than it would cost Russia, etc. He rattled off reams and reams of economic data to prove how strong the Russian economy was, and all in this sort of jam-packed 75-minute speech. And then he had a video message from the Egyptian president and then one from the Chinese president. And then him and Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, the Kazakh president, who'd also previously given a much smaller speech, were sitting next to each other in these armchairs, and they had a 2-hour, quite freewheeling question and answer session. And it was during this question and answer session that Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, the Kazakh president, told Putin to his face that he didn't agree with his support for the rebel regions in Donbass, which I've never seen before. I've never seen anyone challenge Putin on stage, live on TV. It was remarkable.
Wow. And what was Putin's response?
Well, there was a stunned sort of murmur in the audience because this was just incredible. And Tokayev owes Putin big time for backing him in January during the unrest in Kazakhstan and sending down the 2,000 paratroopers, which shored up his power in a internal power struggle. So Tokayev owes Putin, and here he was saying that under international law, Kazakhstan could not and would not recognize the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, which the Kremlin says is one of the core reasons for its invasion. Putin sat there, stony faced, sucking in his lips. Didn't say anything immediately. Didn't sort of his facial expression was just blank as it often is. And then the moderator kicked in, and she sort of pushed the interview, the sort of Q&A session forward a bit. But 20 minutes later, Putin sort of reminded Tokayev who is boss in one of those sort of coded messages that he and the Kremlin give out. He said, all of a sudden, he said to sort of a fairly innocuous question, the Soviet Union's history is the Soviet Union is historic Russia, which was code for. And then he went on to say, Kazakhstan, brotherly, etc. No one would dare mess with relations with Kazakhstan, but Ukraine we could have had a brotherly relationship with Ukraine, but then they went and did their own thing, went pro-West, and we had to invade. So it was Kremlin code for the Soviet Union is ours. We can do what we want in the Soviet Union. We're happy to be friends with you, Kazakhstan, Tokayev, but you have to do as we tell you. And if you don't, then good luck to you, because we invaded Ukraine because they didn't do what we told them to do. So it was a big sort of reminder about who is the top dog.
And how did Putin's comments go down in Kazakhstan? Are people there worried about an invasion, or do they just think that, as you said, that was just a kind of coded put down to Tokayev?
No, people here are genuinely worried about an invasion, and it's this big sort of where next guessing game. If there is going to be a next, where would it be guessing game that a lot of us are playing right now? And I've been, this has been like a 5-week trip, and I've been dotting around the sort of borders of Russia and sort of taking the pulse, so to speak. And here in Kazakhstan, Almaty, which is a long way from the borders, southeastern corner, people will tell you straight away, yeah, totally worried about it. Putin's gone crazy, and he could easily march his armies into northern Kazakhstan and grab it. And then 3.5 hour flight away in the northwest corner of Kazakhstan is this town Udalsk, which has very much the feel of a Russian Tsarist town. It was sort of the southern boundary for some time of the Tsar's empire, and it has all this imperial Russian architecture, etc. And up there, around about a third of the population are ethnic Russians. And speaking to people up there, it is even more acute, the concerns that people have. And what I picked up is a lot of the Russians in these places are watching and listening to the Russian propaganda coming out of the Kremlin, and it is hardening opinions. So the ethnic Russians, this is obviously a generalization, and it's not 100% true, but it is, a long way there. A lot of the Russians are becoming increasingly pro-Kremlin or pro-Russia, while the ethnic Kazakhs are becoming increasingly wary of their ethnic Russian neighbors, etc. And I've been talking to some some Kazakh government officials here in Nur-Sultan, and they will privately tell you that they are. This is a huge worry. On the record, they're a bit more sort of blasé about it, but off the record, they're like, yeah, this is a very, very tricky situation. Of course, with the Russian army getting bogged down in Ukraine, Putin's capacity to strike on another front is dented. But the Kazakh army really would be no match even for a weakened Russian army. So yeah, it's alarming, to say the least.
This is absolutely fascinating. Thanks, James. I've just got one more question from me before I'm sure Francis will have some thoughts as well. Minerals and energy, some of the really big links between the Central Asian states, as you've said, and Russia. Could you give us a sense of the kind of economic links that exist? You've mentioned oil pipelines. How dependent are the Central Asian states on Russia, or is it the other way around, or is that the wrong way to think of it?
No, that's a fairly accurate way to think of it. Well, okay. Let's look at so Kazakhstan's wealth is built on oil and gas, mainly pumped out of West Kazakhstan, and minerals, rare earths, metals, etc., which are mainly found in North and East Kazakhstan. But we can take one example. There's a pipeline called the Caspian Petroleum Consortium (CPC), which pumps oil from fields in West Kazakhstan into Russia, around the north, sort of around the northern edge of the Caspian Sea, and out into and sort of ends up in a Russian Black Sea port, Novorossiysk. And about in April, and this is a very important pipeline. This is the biggest oil pipeline going west out of Kazakhstan. A lot of the Kazakh energy goes east into China. This is the biggest one, the biggest pipeline going west, carrying Kazakh oil. And it was considered, when it was completed, I'm not sure when, I think it was the early 2000s or late 1990s. It was considered one of the sort of biggest international successes, energy sort of consortiums. Russia, the US, there's US companies involved, there's UK companies involved, there's Kazakh companies involved, etc., etc. But it means that Kazakhstan and its oil industry are very vulnerable to what the Kremlin wants to do. And the Kremlin ordered, or someone ordered, Russian authorities ordered it to be closed down at the beginning of April or the end of March. I'm not sure exactly when. They said there was storm damage and they needed to repair it, etc. And so they shut it down for a month. Now, the evidence of storm damage was very thin. And most analysts think that this was actually a warning that the Russians could take out this pipeline at any moment. So, I mean, that's just one example of how reliant Kazakhstan is on Russia's on decent ties with Russia to function properly.
Just one more observation from me before Francis comes in. From everything you've said, it seems absolutely exhausting that you have to constantly decode things that nothing is ever as it seems. What Putin says might be a threat. It might not be. There might be with the oil pipeline. Is it from storm damage? Is it not? Is it seen as a threat to the energy industry? What kind of experience does that mean for the people living there, that you're constantly never really sure what actually Russia wants or is saying?
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. I think when you live here and you're involved in the system, you're trying to work it out, you get used to playing these coded games, and these sort of statements, which could mean one thing or another thing, and how to translate them into real actions, they sort of trickle down. So they also exist at company level, in newspapers, in official doublespeak, etc. So I mean, you get used to it. It's also exhausting for journalists trying to read between the lines all the time as well. But we like the people living here in Kazakhstan have to just keep trying to work it out. And there was some big messages sent out by Putin on Friday, that was for sure.
Well, thank you very much, James. Francis, I'm sure you've been listening very, very, very attentively the last 20 minutes. Do you have any questions for James?
Of course, and that was absolutely fascinating to hear James's testimony of what it's like on the ground in these really important territories that, of course, we've sort of touched on at various different times since the invasion, but now we can sort of give the attention to that they deserve. And this, my first question is you were talking about the tensions there within Kazakhstan and how clearly the leader of Kazakhstan is sending a message to Putin, is not happy about the direction of travel over Ukraine. Just wonder how does, I suppose, Kazakhstan's defiance compare with some of these other former Soviet states? Do they all share a fairly similar perspective on the Russian threat, or do some of them actually, are there others that perhaps are more sympathetic to Moscow?
Yeah, great question. I would say that each one of these states from right across from the South Caucasus, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, and the 5 Central Asian states, they all have their own deal. They all have their own relationships with the Kremlin, and they all have their own complexities. There are major Russian army bases, for example, with a couple of thousand men in Armenia and Tajikistan, and there are Russian soldiers running around, or sort of patrolling around, rather, Armenia, trying to keep a peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan around the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh. And then you have in Kyrgyzstan, switching back to the Central Asia area, in Kyrgyzstan, you have a leader who came to power in a coup in 2020, who has been very pro-Kremlin since he took over, including going as far as to be, I think, the only one to vocally support Putin's war in Ukraine. And then you've got Georgia, back in the South Caucasus, which was invaded in 2008 by Russia, of course, but has used to be incredibly pro-West and pro-EU. But the governing party there, Georgian Dream, is bankrolled and backed by a very wealthy guy, the wealthiest guy in Georgia, who earned all his money in Russia and actually has pro-Russia leanings and sentiment, to the extent where Ukraine has accused Georgia, and of course, I don't know where this story is going to go. They accused Georgia of helping Russia evade sanctions. But I have to caveat this, that the Georgian government has denied it. So there's, each state has its own complexities and relationships with the Kremlin, and Kazakhstan, with its huge border, with its large Russian population, has a particularly difficult tightrope to walk.
I only asked this question because you mentioned it as a sort of explicit threat, and we were talking, and you mentioned there that you don't think necessarily that it would be particularly easy for Putin to launch some sort of invasion of these territories if, as some have feared, this is some sort of broader plan to rebuild the Soviet Union that, that would be very challenging given the scales of the defeats that he's faced in Ukraine. It seems unlikely. But let's say that he were to attempt to do that. Just you said that Kazakhstan would fall very easily. How, if there were some sort of extended conflict on those borders with these five former Soviet states, what would that war look like? Would it be something that would be over, you expect, very, very quickly? Or would it be the situation where, because of geographical reasons, because of issues around morale or good leadership, that this could actually be a similar situation of Ukraine if the worst were to happen?
Okay. Firstly, it needs to be pointed out the only Central Asian state with a border with Russia is Kazakhstan. All the other 4 lie south of Kazakhstan. So a land invasion would obviously require going through Kazakhstan. We have to keep this in perspective. There's no doubt about it that Putin is in very belligerent mood, and he's been reinvigorated, like I said, by his relative military successes in Donbass, which are coming at an enormous cost. And his main project, it seems, from listening to him so much and watching him, etc., is this sort of reinstatement of the USSR and the Peter the Great sort of land grab for Russians. Now, this doesn't necessarily, I mean, in Ukraine, we've seen him physically take back land or capture Ukrainian land and put Russian flags all over it. And that is a very old school and very terrible imperialist approach to his sort of his grand idea. But he can also exert huge influence and pretty much regard these former Soviet states as his domain, just by pulling levers and pushing the right buttons. So many of the analysts here in Kazakhstan say there's absolutely no need for Putin to risk another invasion in Kazakhstan, because he pretty much can control the country anyway, up to a point. This is so that context has to be taken. But this point does keep needing to be made as well. The Kazakh army is small and not particularly experienced or particularly well equipped, and they also Kazakhstan has no aspirations to join NATO or the EU. It's way out. It's too far away, etc. And so if there was some sort of invasion or whatever by Russian forces, it would get no backup. So it would all just be over. And as we've seen in Donbass, Putin likes to use the pretext of defending ethnic Russians' interests to trigger military action. And in the northern Kazakhstan, he has, I think there's 3.5 million ethnic Russians in Kazakhstan out of a population of about 16.5 million. And a lot of those live in North Kazakhstan.
Question from me, James. Actually, my final question is: you mentioned the story on Friday about about Putin and Tokayev at the Economic Forum. Where does this story go next? How does Kazakhstan and the other Central Asian states continue to walk the tightrope, as you said, between Russia, the war in Ukraine, China, and the West?
It's going to be fascinating to watch them do it. At the weekend, Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen leader, who's a staunch Putin ally, issued one of his many video updates to his Telegram channel, in which he openly threatens Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. I'm not sure why he picked on Azerbaijan. I have to dig deeper into it. But Kazakhstan, he basically told them to get into line or face the consequences. Coming so quickly after Putin's speech on Friday and the sort of the indignity that Putin would have felt. I mean, analysts say that Tokayev, the Kazakh president, humiliated him live on TV. There was definitely an element of that. This was Kadyrov issuing a threat to Kazakhstan 2 days after the Kazakh leader had humiliated or gone against Putin live on TV. So that's not a good thing from the Kazakh perspective. Last month as well, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian Foreign Ministry, lobbed more problems Kazakhstan's way when he said that Kazakhstan hosts US bio labs, which may or may not be producing biological weapons. Now, this is important because the Russians have accused Georgia and Ukraine of hosting biolabs linked to US, which have produced weapons previously. The US and Ukraine and Georgia have all denied this. They just say they're doing research on coronavirus and other civilian-orientated projects. But the Kremlin keeps talking about this, and the Kremlin has also used this in their propaganda to justify invasion of Ukraine. So it was not good to hear Lavrov start to talk about in the same vein with Kazakhstan. There's also been other Kremlin-linked commentators who have been tough on Kazakhstan, and in the Russian media after Tokayev's defiance, or after Tokayev pointed out to Putin that Kazakhstan did not support his policy in the Donbass, there was definitely some angry commentary in Russian media the next day.
I just have one more question, if I may, James, which is about what you were saying about how Russian-speaking people, ethnic Russians in Kazakhstan and elsewhere, have been sort of swept up in some of this Russian propaganda coming out from the Kremlin. Just wanted to hear your general sort of description, really, about what information is read in these states. I mean, is it I imagine, as you say, a lot of it is coming from the Kremlin, but what is their sources to receive that information? Is this sort of mainstream state TV? Is this through back channels? And likewise, with Western media, Western perspectives on what's going on in Ukraine, how does that filter through, or does it? Just very interested in getting your sense of how the information landscape operates in these places.
So I think a lot of the Russian and Russian-speaking population in North Kazakhstan, they are watching Russian mainstream TV and watching and reading mainstream Telegram and internet channels. That's just the way that they would pick up their news because of their sort of natural inclination to support Russia and the Kremlin, and they are picking up all these stories about how the tortures and massacres in Bucha was a Western MI6 fake plot. How the Russian speakers in the Donbass region are being completely marginalized. How Putin, needed to trigger this war, etc. So they're just picking up exactly the same stuff that would be read inside Russia, which is hardcore, constant propaganda, which is justifying the Russian invasion, etc. And I had an interesting insight into this last night, actually, because Kazakhstan is a neutral country, and so there you get Russians coming here to do business, etc. And in the bar of the hotel that I was staying, that I'm currently staying in central Nur-Sultan or Astana, as it was called until 2019, there was a Russian businessman there, and we chatted. And he was just telling me, completely wrong, and Putin's completely right, etc. And he's obviously an intelligent guy from St. Petersburg, got a small business. He'd come here to buy a brand new car because it's cheaper, etc. So there was that very fascinating insight, which is quite rare these days, unfortunately, because we can't get into Russia, where I was able to chat for an hour or so over a beer with this Russian businessman and get his insight into the invasion of Ukraine and why NATO's to blame and why MI6 are doing sort of creating these fakes in Bucha, etc. So yeah, Nur-Sultan as a meeting spot, it could get quite interesting because you pick up viewpoints here which you don't get in the West.
Well, thank you very much, James and Francis, for your time. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And of course, if you've got questions, please do write in. I do believe we're out of time here, though. So, Francis and James, can I ask for your final thoughts? What should our listeners be paying attention to? What should they be thinking of going into this week? Francis, would you like to go first? And then we'll give the final thoughts to James.
Sure. So I spoke earlier about the military significance of Snake Island, which has obviously become this sort of land replacement for the Moskva, potentially being seized by Ukrainian High Command, or at least targeted by Ukrainian High Command. I think that's going to be very significant over the coming days, and the implications of that. But I just wanted to mention again a story that I alluded to last week, that I think more research is ongoing on this area, but I'm very interested in it because I think it's not received the perhaps news coverage that it deserves because of the challenges of reporting on it, which is around these deportations. And we heard over the weekend from Interfax, which is a Russian state-controlled news agency, citing the Russian military, that more than 1.9 million Ukrainians have been forcibly deported to Russia since the start of the invasion, with over of them being 300,000 children. And I mean, these are just staggering numbers. I spoke last week about why, of course, they might be wanting to do this. It's, attempts effectively to, you've got control over the minds of the next generations of Ukrainians in the Donbass regions, potentially. Also the power in which you have over people who could potentially threaten the regime. But I mean, these numbers are almost, just the staggering scope of this, and the fact that they may even be going to camps set up in Russia. I mean, it almost, when one reads about this, sounds like something well, certainly from the Soviet Union, but maybe even sort of Stalinist in this attempt to seize people from certain places and effectively send them to places in Russia where it's very hard for them to communicate and have no chance of escape, and effectively like the old Gulag archipelago. So I as I say, this is something I'm very interested in, and I'm planning to do some more research into, because I think it's a story that is underappreciated. And I just wanted to mention it because we've actually heard some verified statistics from the Russian state itself, and as I say, they make very concerning reading. So that's my final thought for today.
Thank you, Francis. And James, would you like to give your final word?
Yeah, sure. Francis, I wrote a story about this from Narva about a month ago. So we've covered a bit of it. Not that stat from the Interfax is new, but definitely interesting. And this sort of my research up in Uralsk in northwest Kazakhstan also reminded me rather that this sort of flow of people is two-way. Uralsk had sucked in or become a home to many Russians fleeing, anti-war Russians fleeing Russia as well, and setting up home in Uralsk, and I had an opportunity to speak to them, so I'm going to try and write about that somewhere. As far as the bigger picture is concerned, I think the main story is a slow grinding Russian machine, making its way through Donbass, and how quickly it can wrap up its victory there, which is looking likely, and more on Putin and whether he lashes out again at former Soviet states who may not be doing what he wants them to do all the time.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly with us by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Sophie Coe.